The UPSC CSE arena is an ever-evolving space where staying up to date becomes as crucial as maintaining a thorough preparation. With strategic planning and holistic coverage for exam syllabus, Vision IS Delhi presents GS Foundation course. Avail analysis and integration of current affairs with GS syllabus. All India test series with an innovative assessment system, inculcating post-test analysis, discussion, All India ranking, and more. Explore the holistic learning modules intrinsically designed for the ideal aspirant.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So we'll be discussing the questions that have been asked in this year's mains examinations from the ethics. And even though we usually divide the section of ethics into three sections, three subsections. One is the case study section, one is the ethics and governance section, and then the rest of the theoretical portion in ethics. But this year we have divided only into two. But what you would notice in the ethics paper this year, especially in the theoretical questions or the section A of the paper, is that most of the questions are rooted in issues related to administration and governance. Apart from the questions that I am going to be discussing right now with you, which would include questions related to ethics of international relations, or which would be related to foundational values of civil services or code of ethics and a few other topics. A few other questions also that have been asked in the ethics section A this year relate to ethics and governance portion directly or indirectly. For example, the first question which has been asked this year was on the artificial intelligence and its application in decision making within the administration and the ethical considerations of that. Now, this is of course a topic which we can put in technology and ethics, but it of course directly relates to ethics and governance. Similarly, a question that was asked related to the environmental ethics this year is again something which can go into the area of ethics in international relations, even though you can relate it to the other broader themes as well. So that's one observation which is there. This year, before I begin talking about the question specifically, the general understanding that we have had after talking to the candidates is the paper was slightly lengthier. And it's always been lengthy, of course, in ethics, but this year it was even more lengthier. There were reasons for that, because in the section A of the paper as well, questions were a bit lengthy to read, and secondly, they also required response in multiple dimensions. So questions were not just asking one particular aspect, but there were multiple subparts of the questions which were there in section A this year. So that all the more made the paper more difficult as compared to the previous years. And that's why our expectation is that this year, not just in the other general studies paper, which may seem very easy to people because you may think that you know those topics, but this year the cutoffs in our estimation are going to be slightly lower, and scores are on an average going to be slightly lower in general studies papers, because even though the papers may seem easy, but they were difficult. As we have discussed in GS paper 2 as well, the paper may seem easy because the questions were asked from topics that were known to each one of us. But what was required was writing skills. What was required was to be able to understand the requirement of the question. And that is not something which was very easy. This year in ethics portion as well, section A, the questions that I'm going to discuss, questions required you to understand what the examiner is specifically demanding, because the answer or your response to those questions has to be very specific in nature. If you sway here and there, you may not end up getting the desired marks that you may want from the examiner. Anyway, so with those particular initial comments with respect to the paper this year, let's have a look at the questions that were asked. So the first question that we are going to deal with is related to the area of international ethics and or ethics in international relations. UPSC has asked few questions from this topic in the recent years. I have been repeatedly stating in the foundation batch classes as well that ethics in international relation and corporate governance are two topics which have suddenly gained a lot of importance in the paper in last 5 to 6 years. So you have to specifically give a lot of importance to these topics, and whenever you read any newspaper articles in international relations, you have to keep the ethical dimension also in your mind. But the basic approach that we discuss in our classes with respect to these questions is going to remain the same. So let's have a look at the question, and then we will try to understand if there are any previous year questions also that have been asked which could have guided us in answering those questions that were asked this year. So the question was, it is not enough to talk about peace, but one must believe in it, and it is not enough to believe in it, one must act upon it. So simply talking about peace is not going to be enough. You must have conviction, you must have belief in the idea of peace. And just having belief is also not enough. You must actually show through your actions that you are committed to international peace and cooperation. Now, in this particular context, it says that in the present context, where we are witnessing so many wars and conflicts between nations, we know of so many of them. We know about Saudi Arabia and Yemen. We know about the conflict in Myanmar, the conflict in Israel, Gaza. We can also talk about the conflict between Iran and Israel now, conflict between Russia and Ukraine, conflict in South Sudan, right? So there are so many such conflicts that exist across the world today. So it says that in the present context, the major weapon industries of the developed nations are adversely influencing continuation of number of wars for their own self-interest. So number of weapon industries across the world, especially in the developed countries of the world, are involved in providing continuous supply of arms in conflict zones of the world, and they are primarily doing it for their own self-interest. But in the process, what they're doing is that they are aggravating these conflicts even further. One simple example would be the entire Rohingya crisis and the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingyas in Myanmar. There have been consistent efforts which have been made by the Janta or the regime in Myanmar in order to reach out to Israel for getting weapons for the cleansing or for various actions that they have been taking up in their own nation. Similarly, if we look at South Sudan, or for that matter, if we look at the conflict which we have seen in Sri Lanka earlier, LTT, again there was involvement of Israel. Well, they provided weapons. South Africa is another nation which has been having a very developed weapon industry, and they have been consistently involved in providing weapons to various countries in Africa and outside Africa where conflicts exist, right? So it's talking about that. So it says that all around the world, what are the ethical considerations of powerful nations in today's international arena to stop continuation of ongoing conflicts? That is, what are the ethical perspectives, what are the ethical arguments that should drive the powerful nations of the world to try and stop, to try and prohibit these ongoing conflicts? So you have to talk about the ongoing conflicts very briefly. Of course, this question is not about international relations. This question is about ethics of international relations. Secondly, you have to also talk about the reasons because of which some of these developed countries or the weapon industries in these developed countries are involved in providing weapons as a part of promoting these conflicts even further. And third, what are the ethical concerns or reasons because of which these nations should take steps in order to stop these ongoing conflicts? What are the ethical considerations that should be kept in mind for them to stop these conflicts? This is what the question is all about, right? So in this question, primarily, therefore, we have to talk about three things. One, we have to, as I said, give a brief reference to the ongoing conflicts, international conflicts. Secondly, we have to talk about what is the motivation or economic interest behind the supply of weapons in these conflict zones by the weapon industries of these particular developed countries. Thirdly, we have to talk about what are the ethical reasons or what are the ethical considerations that should drive the action of these developed or powerful countries of the world to stop the ongoing conflicts. Right? These are the three parts of the question that should specifically be mentioned in our answer, apart from, of course, the usual introduction, conclusion, etc., and all of those things. Now, what is a possible way in which we can introduce this particular answer? Right? Of course, one way is that you explain the statement itself, that there are various weapon industries in advanced nations of the world that are involved in providing weapons to the various countries that often end up aggravating the conflict further, even though they may be provided for self-defense purposes, even though they may be provided as a part of collaborative effort between these countries to develop technology, but it often ends up creating an adverse situation as well. So that could be one possible introduction. Or a simpler introduction would be that you simply give a reference to some of the ongoing conflicts in the world. So you can mention that ongoing conflict in today's international scenario or today's international arena include some of the conflicts. So you may mention about some of the ongoing conflicts. You may talk about Israel, Palestine. You may talk about the Iran, Israel, or Rohingya crisis. Or you may talk about Saudi Arabia and Yemen, or Russia and Ukraine, whichever you may want to talk about. You don't need to make a list of this. Just 2-3 of them should be enough. Let's say if you just mention one, what you can also do is you can probably draw a small diagram and you can make maybe a circle and you can say ongoing conflicts, and then you can make a mention of various conflicts, right? Again, there is no need to explain all of these conflicts. I'm just trying to tell you a way in which you can possibly add value to your answers without really wasting space and time. That's all I'm talking about. So once you have talked about that, you may then talk about these conflicts and relate it to what the impact of these conflicts has been. So I'm just rubbing this off. You may talk about possibly the impact of these conflicts. Again, very briefly. Very briefly, you have to talk about that it can lead to loss of human lives. It can lead to environmental damage. It can lead to further aggravation of war between the nations. It can lead to violation of human rights, right? So all those few things you can mention. So these conflicts lead to violation of human rights, loss of human lives, and environmental degradation, makes world an unsafe place to live in, right? That is it. Now, once you have mentioned that, then you can come to the reference with respect to why these weapon industries are providing these weapons to the various conflict zones because of economic interests. So you now come to why this is happening. Again, very briefly, because see, the main crux of the question is this. ये main part है question का. So, as I said, अगर आपने ये introduction लिया है, तो then you will have to explain this a bit. Or you can simply start from here and maybe include reference to some of the ongoing conflicts here and there in your answer, or probably just draw a diagram that these are the ongoing conflicts in the world. Bas. Choice is yours, right? Now, once you mention about the why, what will you be mentioning in why these weapons are being provided? One, of course, because of economic reasons. Yes. Secondly, they are also being provided by the weapon industries of developed nations to the other countries because of strategic reasons. That they gain to stand something out of it by providing help to some other nations. It may also be as a part of collaboration between some of these nations, that they may have a defense partnership with each other. ऐसे कुछ 2-3 reasons बहुत briefly mention कर दिए. There is no need to explain this. Okay. Now, let's say if you miss this as well, it is fine. But since the question is specifically talking about that the major industries of the developed nations are adversely influencing the continuation of number of wars for their own self-interest, it will make sense to possibly explain this self-interest a bit. That's it, just a bit. Once we have done that, then we have to come, what are the ethical reasons or what are the ethical considerations that should be kept in mind by these powerful nations to stop these conflicts? What should drive them to do so? So let's talk about what the ethical considerations should be. See, first ethical consideration that you can talk about is that all the nations have a commitment to international peace and cooperation, and therefore their first attempt should be to resolve all the conflicts not through arms, not through weapons, but with the help of a dialogue based approach. So you can talk about, for example, अब देखिए आप यहां पे इंडिया का रोल ला सकते हैं. The kind of role that India has been trying to play in diffusing the tensions between Russia and Ukraine. We are trying to maintain a balance of relationship between the two countries. Similarly, the role that has been played by India with respect to Israel-Palestine conflict. We have recognized Palestine, but at the same time, we continue to also have good relationship with Israel, right? So you can talk something like that as well. So commitment to international peace and cooperation is one of the most primary or important duties of any nation that should drive them to try to resolve the issues through a dialogue based approach. You can also mention about the provisions of Article 51 of the Indian Constitution, a directive principle of state policy. For example, India's DPSPs and provide a commitment or provide a responsibility on the Indian state to resolve international conflicts through dialogue and a peaceful approach. Yes, something like that we can mention. जरूरी नहीं है आप इसको यहाँ पे यूज करें, आप इसको इंट्रोडक्शन में भी लिख सकते हो, कंक्लूजन में भी लिख सकते हो. Right? Depends completely on you, but I'm just trying to give you some fodder points which you can be using in your answers. So this is one point that you can be mentioning about. Secondly, you should also mention that it is the duty of the nations to ensure compliance with international laws and especially arms treaties. So as a part of that commitment as well, it is important for the nations to keep up their ethical commitment towards international law, towards any of the armed treaties, and that is one ethical consideration that they should keep in mind to stop these ongoing conflicts by stopping the flow of arms to the nations, and they should follow the international law. So that is the second thing which you can talk about. Third you can talk about is that it is very important for the nations to conduct end use monitoring. They should ensure that weapons and arms are only supplied to those countries that have a good track record. Or in other words, you can mention that these weapons should not be provided to those nations which have a poor human rights record. This should be monitored by the nations which are providing the weapons to these conflict zones. It is also important for them to ensure that these weapons are not provided to dictatorial regimes, right? So these weapons should not be handed over to dictatorial regimes. They should be very careful in ensuring that these weapons, advanced technologies, land up only in the hands of individuals, those who are governed as per democratic norms, the regimes which are governed in a civilian manner, not in the hands of military regimes, so to say. So that is another thing that you could be talking about. ना end use monitoring बहुत जरूरी है. जैसे कि we have seen consistently, despite the poor record of Myanmar or Saudi Arabia in human rights, they have been consistently supplied weapons by some of the powerful Western nations, including US and Israel. So there is a need to stop that as well, is something which you can be talking about. You should also talk about that nations have an important commitment towards sustainable development over militarization. So that is also very important ethical consideration that should be kept in mind by the nations while they are trying to stop these ongoing conflicts. They should try to divert funds, resources that they have towards the needs of the people, towards developmental concerns, rather than promoting militarization, rather than promoting formation of blocks, etc. is also something that you can talk about, right? So ये भी एक important point आप कह सकते हैं. And then lastly, you can mention that supply of any of these arms, weapons, etc. should not come at the cost of human lives. It shouldn't come at the cost of human lives. So you can mention these things. Towards the end, you can possibly talk about how if you have seen the movie Oppenheimer, right, where he talks about the dilemma which he is facing, where have I created something which is going to destroy the mankind or not, right? So you could talk about that there is a great power which these nations have, and they need to use this power with greater responsibility in order to ensure that the world becomes a safer place to live in. इस तरीके से आप इसको conclude कर सकते हैं. Or you can say that powerful nations of the world continuously need to deliberate various peace efforts, they need to uphold international laws, and they should try to mitigate the conflicts across the world through dialogue based approach. इस तरीके से आप इस क्वेश्चन को कंक्लूड कर सकते हैं, राइट? सो द पॉइंट बीइंग, if you just think in a very commonsensical manner as well, that what are the things that we can talk about here? I can talk about commitment to international peace and security. I can talk about that these weapons should not be supplied to those countries which have a poor track record or which use them for ethnic cleansing. These weapons should not be provided. There should be a lot of monitoring and strict accountability that should be enforced on them. You could talk about that it should not come at the cost of the human lives. It is important that sustainable development should be promoted over militarization, and they should also try to showcase their commitment to international laws, arms treaties, etc. Right? Now, on this particular question, there is already a very similar kind of a question which was asked by UPSC a couple of years back, and this one was related to the just war theory that we also discussed in the class, that Russia and Ukraine war has been going on for the last 7 months. Different countries have taken different independent stands and actions keeping in view their own national interest. We are all aware that the war has its own impact on different aspects of society, including human tragedy. What are those ethical issues that are crucial to be considered while launching the war and its continuation so far? तो यहाँ पर भी वही same चीजें broadly discuss हुई थी, that you have to talk about that countries should launch a war or should continue a war only when it is justified through the ends. Secondly, minimal damage should be caused to civilian lives as a result of the war. Thirdly, the war should be due to just reasons as well. It should not be due to ulterior motives. Fourthly, you should try to use those weapons which cause minimum damage, right? So all those things can also be brought in to this particular question as well. Now, I would not say that this was a very easy question, but this was definitely a question which could have been resolved. You could have written the answer had you shown some presence of mind, and if you just talk about some aspects of some basic values which are supposed to be upheld in international relations. Now, let's move on to the next question.
Does the vast syllabus of general studies for the UPSC Prelims overwhelm you to initiate your preparation for the civil services examination? Is your apprehension and self-doubt coming in the way of your success in joining the civil services? Comprehend your preparation for UPSC Prelims 2025 with the fast-track course targeting general studies with innovative curriculum, revision and mentorship. Starting from 19th November at 1 p.m, the course offers coverage of UPSC GS Prelims subjects, dedicated mentorship support and guidance for performance maximization, access to PT 365 classes for current affairs preparation, sectional mini tests for regular assessment and performance, personalized student portal to access study material, access to live and online classes. Enroll today and make prelims your stepping stone to proceed to the UPSC mains.
The concept of the just and unjust is contextual. What was just a year back may turn out to be unjust in today's context. Changing context should be constantly under scrutiny to prevent miscarriage of justice. AC. Examine the above statement with the help of suitable examples. Now see, what it is basically saying is, जो पहला quotation दिया है, values, morals, ethics are not always static in nature. They change according to time. They change according to place. What may have been just earlier may be unjust today. What may be unjust today may be just tomorrow. Right? There are numerous examples of this. So in the first part of the question, you need to ideally explain this statement itself. That is, concept of just and unjust is contextual. What is right? Just here means what is the right thing to do? What is justice? Justice is contextual in nature. It says that what was just a year back may turn out to be unjust in today's context. For example, slavery was justified, was something that was held to be acceptable in the society, in the human society, for a very long time. But today we believe that it is against the idea of dignity of any individual. Similarly, patriarchal norms, women till recently were not allowed a share in the ancestral property as per, let's say, the Hindu law in India. But now this is perceived very differently. We believe that daughters should have equal rights in the ancestral property as the sons should have. So we are talking about equality. What was unjust earlier, what was just earlier has become unjust today. Child marriage may have been justified earlier, but we do not justify it today. Why is that happening? Because scientific evidence has come in that child marriage is detrimental to the well-being of the child, is detrimental to the well-being of the society. So there are numerous reasons because of which our perspective is changing. It is changing because of evolving laws. It is changing because of evolving awareness. It is changing because of scientific evidence. It is changing because of the judgments of the courts as well. For example, a few years back, LGBTQ plus or homosexual relationships were considered as criminal. But then came the judgment of the court in Navteej Singh Johar case and it turned around the things. So those are the things that we have to talk about in this question. So concept of just and unjust is contextual. What was just a year back may turn out to be unjust in today's context. Changing context should be constantly under scrutiny. ये changing जो society की requirements हैं उसको constantly हमें scrutinize करना जरूरी है to prevent miscarriage of justice. So what for that would we'll have to do? We'll have to reform laws. We'll have to create awareness. We'll have to come out with newer judicial interpretation that expand the fundamental rights or expand the ambit of the equality for all the people. Examine the above statement with suitable examples. So now see, in this particular question, if I have to just quickly talk about what are the things which should be there in our answer. Firstly, we need to explain the statement itself very briefly, and that could be the introduction itself of your answer. Secondly, you have to give some examples of how what was unjust earlier has, or what was just earlier has become unjust today. So give some examples there. And thirdly, you have to talk about that how we can ensure change in values as per context in order to ensure true justice. Right? So now, how do we begin the answer? You begin by explaining that justice or ethicality is not a static concept. It changes across time and it changes across space. Right? What may have been justified earlier cannot be justified in today's world. It is a very nuanced concept. You can even start with talking about the concept of dharma. See, ancient Indian philosophy talks about the concept of dharma. What is dharma? Justice. What is the right thing to do? But the concept of dharma, they say, is very difficult to grasp. They say dharma is sukshma. It is very nuanced. What is right and what is wrong, to arrive at that conclusion can take a lot of practice and also a lot of rigorous thinking. And that may also evolve over a period of time. So you may relate it to the concept of dharma, or you may simply talk about that the concept of justice is not static, or values, ethics, morality change across time. Right? You explain that, right? They are not static. They evolve with societal changes. They evolve with the time, they evolve with the changing norms of the society as well. And some of the examples of the same would be as follows. So you explain justice is not static, or concept of dharma is something which is again not static. It keeps varying across time. So there is variation across time, space, societal norms, etc. जब आपने ये मेंशन कर दिया, then you give some examples related. For example, give a few examples. I gave you a few examples already. You may give examples of patriarchy. इसको ना एब्सोल्यूट और रिलेटिव एथिक्स के कॉन्सेप्ट से भी रिलेट कर सकते हैं, जैसे भी आप देखना चाहें. एनीवे, सो यू टॉक अबाउट पेट्रियार्की, हाउ पेट्रियार्कल नॉर्म्स हैव चेंज. प्रैक्टिकल एग्जांपल्स दीजिएगा, ठीक है. तो जैसे विमेन राइट इन एंसेस्ट्रल प्रॉपर्टी वाला मैंने बताया, यू गिव दैट एग्जांपल. देखिए इसमें बहुत सारे एग्जांपल्स हैं, एक कोई पर्टिकुलर चीज नहीं है जो आप लिखें. फॉर एग्जांपल, वी टॉक अबाउट प्रिवेसी लॉज. वाज एनीवन इवन टॉकिंग अबाउट प्रिवेसी 20 years back? Forget about that. 10 years back, no one was talking about privacy. But today, privacy has become so important, right? So you talk about that. You may mention about that how the Supreme Court in the case Puttaswamy case has held that it is a very important part of ensuring dignity of any individual. You may talk about slavery, child marriage, abortion, right? There have been so many debates over abortion laws as well, that whether women should be allowed to decide whether they want to abort a child or not. And there have been varying norms of the society on this particular issue as well. You can mention that also. You can talk about same-sex relationships, the idea of gender, how it has evolved. So there are numerous examples to talk about here. Question is, how many will you write? I would suggest that, see, if you're having 150 word limit, and if you have already written maybe 20 words in the introduction, and you are saving maybe 15-20 words for your conclusion, that means you have around 100-120 words left. And then you have to write the how part of it as well, which will easily take up 30-40 words. Which means that you have around 70 words, 60 to 70 words, which are now spare with you, right? This planning has to be done by you in the exam hall itself, but this will not happen in the exam hall. This will happen much before the exam hall, when you will practice writing the questions. So now if I have to write in 60-70 words, and if I will end up writing maybe 15 words on each, or maybe 20 words on each, then I don't really have scope to write all 6 or 10. I will write only probably 4. Maybe at max 5. Don't worry about कि मैंने कम point लिखे हैं. Don't worry. Even if you write 3 properly, you will get marks. I can assure you that. Right? What is important is that the requirement of the question should be addressed in an effective manner. So once you have mentioned about all of these things with the examples, then you talk about that how we can ensure. क्योंकि second part of the question क्या कह रहा है? Again, you please see. It is saying that changing context should be constantly under scrutiny. तो ये कैसे होगा, ये बताना जरूरी है. हमने इंपॉर्टेंस तो बता दिया इसका, why this is important, but how this can be ensured is what you need to talk about. So changing context or scrutiny of changing context. So then you can relate it to the last part of the question by saying that therefore, it is important to evaluate, to assess the changing context through various measures consistently. How? First, change in laws. प्रिवेसी लॉ का मेंशन कर दीजिएगा अगर प्रिवेसी के बारे में बात किया है. अबॉर्शन लॉ का मेंशन कर दीजिएगा अगर अबॉर्शन के बारे में बात किया है. राइट? सेक्सुअल हरासमेंट ऑफ विमेन एट वर्क प्लेस के बारे में बात कर दीजिएगा. लॉ बात के बारे में बात कर दीजिए अगर उसके बारे में बात किया. वॉट एवर यू हैव टॉक्ड अबाउट in the first part of the answer, you talk about that change in laws. You can also talk about creating awareness and education in the society is as important in order to understand what is the scrutiny that is required of the changing context, so that whatever we are doing is just, whatever we are doing is right, so that miscarriage of justice doesn't happen. You can also talk about that judicial interpretation also needs to evolve over a period of time in order to suit the changing context of the values and the norms in the society as well. Once you have mentioned this, so then you can, if you remember, in our syllabus, they talk about laws, conscience, etc. as a source of ethics. So you should therefore talk about that laws, ethical standards, societal values need to be constantly re-examined through above measures so as to prevent injustice in the society. Scrutiny is important, especially as the society becomes more complicated, as newer problems keep coming up in the society. So you can then, towards the end, in your conclusion, basically talk about the importance of all of the above, right? Importance of constant scrutiny in brief, that's all. Society is becoming more complicated, problems are becoming more challenging, people are demanding more rights, and because of that, there is a need to constantly evolve the norms and the values of the ethical standards of the society as well. I hope that this is clear. Yes, there was one question which was asked by UPSC quite long back, which I could relate to this particular question, which was in 2013. Some people believe that values keep changing with time and situation, while others strongly believe that there are certain universal and entrenched or eternal human values. Give your perception in this regard with due justification. Very similar kind of a question, that values keep changing, norms of the society keep changing, certain values are universal, certain values keep changing. आप ये वाला perspective भी अपने आंसर में कंक्लूजन में लिख सकते हैं. Even though certain things are changing, but some values are universal and they remain static. Truthfulness, honesty, compassion, integrity, right? All of these are examples of certain values that do not ever change, and they continue to remain relevant today as they were possibly 5,000 years back. Is that clear to everyone? Yes? Can we proceed further? Now, the next question. Mindless addiction to form, ignoring the substance of the matter, results in, I'll come back to you, results in rendering of injustice. A perceptive civil servant is one who ignores such literalness and carries out true intent. उसने अपने आप ही एक्सप्लेन कर दिया है इस क्वेश्चन का मतलब क्या है. माइंडलेस एडिक्शन टू फॉर्म का मतलब यह है, फॉर्म मींस लिटरल वर्ड, प्रोसीजर, formalities, bureaucratic guidelines, whereas when it says ignoring the substance of the matter, which is nothing but basically the intent of the law, intent of the procedures, ethical considerations, compassion. So it says that mindless addiction to rules, regulations, etc., and ignoring the intent of the matter results in rendering of injustice. It results in injustice. A perceptive civil servant is one, a civil servant who is perceiving, who is not always going as per his biased notions, is one who ignores such literalness. जो परसीव करता है क्या सिचुएशन है मेरे सामने, अकॉर्डिंग टू दी रिक्वायरमेंट एडजस्ट करता है, एंड कैरीज आउट ट्रू इंटेंट. एग्जामिन द अबव स्टेटमेंट विद सूटेबल इलस्ट्रेशंस. अब देखिए इलस्ट्रेशन बोला है उसने. What does illustration mean? I always explain that illustrations are not necessarily practical examples, but or real examples, but illustrations are that civil servant A is approached by an old woman who does not have documents and is asked to provide some benefits of the scheme and program, and the civil servant turns down that old woman because of lack of documents. ये है illustration. Right? Illustration is A and B and X and Y, and just taking something figuratively and explaining a particular issue. Very interestingly, before I get into the discussion of this particular topic or this question, Let me tell you, this question has been asked in various forms by UPSC earlier. That's why going through previous year questions becomes so important. Because had you gone through these particular previous year questions that were asked by UPSC, then there would have been no problem in answering this question. This is a very standard, typical question. See, in 2015 they asked, a mere compliance with law is not enough. A public servant also has to have a well-developed sensibility for ethical issues for effective discharge of duties. Isn't this the same as what they have asked this year? केवल law से comply मत करो. Then, do you agree? Explain with the help of two examples where an act is ethically right but not legally, and an act is legally right but not ethically. एक और question पूछा. Rules and regulations provided to all the civil servants are the same, yet there is difference in performance. The positive-minded civil servants are able to interpret the rules and regulations in the favor of the case and achieve success, whereas those who are negative-minded officers are unable to achieve the goals by interpreting the same rules and the regulations against the case. Discuss with illustrations. ये 2022 का question है. उसी साल UPSC ने एक और question पूछा in 2022. Wisdom lies in knowing what to reckon with and what to look. An officer being engrossed with the periphery, ignoring the core issues before him, is no rare in bureaucracy. तो आप peripheral issues के ऊपर bother कर रहे हैं. फाइल साइन हो गई, है ना? मंत्री जी का बंदोबस्त हो गया, सब कुछ, everything has been done, or properly or not, rather than focusing on the core issues. ऑफिस के अंदर कंप्यूटर नया लग गया, whether you have reformed the process within the office or not doesn't matter. That is what it is talking about. So it says that, do you agree that such preoccupation of an administrator to peripheral issues leads to travesty of justice to the cause of effective service delivery and good governance? Critically evaluate. यही same तीनों questions हैं largely, broadly, and this is what has been asked this year in the examination. Now again, in this particular question, I would suggest that ideally an introduction should begin with possibly explaining the meaning of the statement. So you can say that in public administration or in civil services, there is always a tension. There is always a conflict between what? Between whether one should adhere to true spirit or to the letter of the law. Yes, there is always a conflict, whether I should follow law or whether I should be going as per the spirit of the law or not. This is how you could explain the initial part of the statement, or you can explain this question with the introduction that you may write, right? Or for example, you may also do one thing, that you may just talk about form. ऐसे आप refer कर सकते हैं. Form refers to rules, regulations, etc. Whereas substance refers to intent. There is always a dilemma that whether a civil servant should follow form or whether he should follow substance. So whichever way you want to introduce. So basically, in the introduction to this particular answer, there are multiple ways. One, you explain form and substance, and then you explain the dilemma that a civil servant often faces between form and substance. Or you simply start by talking about the kind of dilemmas a civil servant faces, where there is always a conflict between spirit of the law versus letter of the law. Okay? Just explain this very briefly in your introduction. Now, what happens as a result of this is something which you need to talk about it, but before that, it's important to give certain examples. So now, the second part of the question will be some examples or illustrations that you would have to give. क्या examples दे सकते हैं? See, one example that we can give here is, let's say, you can talk about disaster, और ना ये जो आपका सब हेडिंग है ये बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट रहेगा, बिकॉज इवन इफ यू डोंट राइट मच विद इन इट, अगर आप उसको बस ऊपर ऊपर से एक सब हेडिंग अच्छे से फ्रेम करते हैं, द मीनिंग विल बी कन्वेड टू द एग्जामिनर. सो यू कैन टॉक अबाउट द डिजास्टर रिलीफ and lack of documents. There is a particular family that comes to you. They say that we have lost all our documents in disaster. Please provide us relief. You refuse. So इसको explain कर सकते हैं. A civil servant turns down the family without documents to provide them disaster relief, results in loss of precious lives. बस इतना ही लिखना है. इसको पूरा कहानी मत explain कीजिएगा. That's it that you need to explain. Okay, so that illustration you will explain. Another example that we can write in this is that lack of legal aid leading to injustice, simply because a person, so you can say that a judge pronounces a particular person guilty, or a person is not able to access justice in the court because of not having access to a lawyer or an attorney. An example of again how form of law is winning over the spirit of law. You can also talk about, again in the judicial perspective only, you can talk about that how if there is over importance that is given to procedures over justice. One person was not able to submit his application in time because he lacked legal awareness, or because he did not know what is the proper procedure to be followed, and you kept making that person run from pillar to post, right? So a person goes to avail of a particular benefit from the government department and he is disabled. The government tells him that you need to come physically to the office for us to be able to deliver this service to you. You must have recently seen that viral video of this woman who was called to the office for availing of a particular service, where she literally was crawling to the government office, right? An example of how again you are giving over importance to form over substance. इसमें बहुत सारे numerous examples दे सकते हैं, but दो illustration भी देंगे तो काम चल जाएगा, right? Once you have mentioned that, we always talk about that how because of Aadhaar biometric data not matching, that ration was denied to a poor woman and her child, and as a result of that the child died. This happened in Jharkhand. This is nothing but an example of giving over importance to form over substance. Now what is the implication of this is what you need to explain. तो जब ये second part कुछ illustrations दे दिया, देखिए क्योंकि सिर्फ examples देना enough नहीं है ना, हम ethical aspect में बात कर रहे हैं, तो we have to talk about certain implications of the above as well. So what are the implications of such a scenario or such a situation which occurs, right? You can say that it promotes inequity. Why? Because you do not look at the position or the background of the person whom you are serving, rather you look at rules. आप ये नहीं देखते कि आदमी है औरत है, आप बस रूल्स ब्लाइंडली लगाते हैं. What does it result in? Inequity. It results in injustice. So you can talk about that. You can say that in a way a civil servant is not upholding the idea of equal protection of the laws. Use these terms, use these jargons in your ethics answer. Only then you will be able to get the marks, right? So you can talk about it. You can say that it leads to erosion of public trust. People lose faith in the government because they believe that everything that is done by the government is only for themselves. They are indifferent to our situation. They are indifferent to our problems. So you can say it shows lack of compassion as well. You can talk about that how it stifles innovation. अगर आप हमेशा stickler for rules हैं, you are not willing to think out of the box. You will not be able to invent new ideas to find newer ways to solve the problem. So you can mention that. You can also talk about that it can lead to slow government processes or bureaucratic decision making can lead to red tapeism. So you can mention that as well. तो इसके कुछ implications वगैरह जो हैं आपने explain कर दिए. Now, in the conclusion, so now see, again, every answer is a story. You see, first I'm talking about ये प्रॉब्लम है, इसके कुछ एग्जाम्पल्स ऐसे हैं, इससे ये इंपैक्ट क्रिएट होता है, एंड देन फाइनली what am I going to talk about? What should a civil servant do ideally? So in conclusion, I would talk about that a civil servant ideally should emphasize on compassion, should stick to basic principles, rule of law, etc., but should be flexible enough to adjust according to the requirements, and therefore यहां पे एक और टर्म हम अपने ही सिलेबस से डाल सकते हैं, and therefore show emotional intelligence in different circumstances. ऐसा कुछ करके हम कंक्लूड कर सकते हैं. You may give some examples as well that you may think of here. कुछ भी सोच सकते हैं ना. For example, you may talk about, see, something like PIL. Isn't it something which is being born out of spirit of law and not true letter of law? True letter of law तो कहता है locus standi, but spirit of law क्या कहता है? सबको justice मिलना चाहिए. Doesn't matter that whether the person knows the technicalities or not. Yes. So you can give that example. और भी बहुत सारे examples जो हैं, anything you could have mentioned in this particular question. I hope that this is clear to all of you. Yes. Yes. You had a question at the back. बोलिए. I didn't get your question. What's the question? हाँ. हाँ. Yeah. You can use that argument as well. See, you don't need to get that technical in the ethics paper is what I would suggest. You don't need to necessarily bring in thinkers in ethics, especially when the question is very simple and straightforward. You can do what you are saying in terms of that, okay, core values and then how much importance you attach to those values, etc. You can talk that perspective, but I would not necessarily suggest you to bring in scholars and unnecessarily complicate your answer. Okay? Yes, any other questions? Puliye. Of course, I mean, that is completely up to you whether you want to include Mahatma Gandhi's quote or something to drive home the point. Completely up to you, है ना. Ethics में देखिए कोई भी सही और गलत आंसर नहीं है. मैं आपको अपनी अप्रोच बता रहा हूँ that this is ideally the approach that I would have taken had I written the answers to these particular questions. I can tell you this, that I'm sure that many of you may be able to write better answers than what I am suggesting here, right? So it can be completely different. You can take a completely different perspective as well. But देखिए कुछ basic aspects of the question तो address करने पड़ेंगे. अब आप उसको कैसे लिखते हैं, how you justify, that is another point. आप quotation से करते हैं, किसी scholar के view से करते हैं, किसी literal example से करते हैं, that is completely up to you. But at the same time, you must understand that the basic things in the question still remain to be the same. For example, in this particular question, you have to give some illustrations. You have to explain what this entire dilemma is. You have to briefly touch upon the implications of this as well, and possibly talk about how the civil servants ideally should behave and balance and resolve these dilemmas. I hope it is clear. Right? Now, let's move on. UPSC usually has refrained from asking questions on code of conduct and code of ethics. Till now, there are only two questions that have been asked. One was a very simple, straightforward question of comparing code of conduct and code of ethics. One was, on what were the recommendations that were provided by the second ARC with respect to the code of ethics, the public service code that was recommended by second ARC. And one, they asked a question once on in the case study section on the code of ethics. Now this question is actually a very straightforward question, but it's important to understand the crux of the question. This question is not about comparison between code of ethics and code of conduct. Because the moment some candidates will see code of conduct, code of ethics, they will start writing code of ethics, code of conduct के बीच में difference. ये वो नहीं है. Question is, code of conduct and code of ethics are sources of guidance in public administration. What other sources of guidance in public administration are? Laws, constitution, right? The conventions, international laws, all of these are sources of guidance in public administration. So आप वहीं से आंसर बिगिन कर सकते हैं अपना, that there are various sources for guiding the ethical behavior of civil servants, including laws, societal values, conscience, constitution, international covenants, and code of ethics and code of conduct. ये भी कर सकते हैं, या फिर ये सब skip कर दीजिए, simply write about importance of code of ethics and code of conduct. Code of ethics and code of conduct are two important ways of ensuring ethical conduct on part of the civil servants. You can write that, or you can say code of conduct, that is a set of do's and don'ts to be followed by civil servants, and code of ethics, that is a set of broad principles to be followed by the civil servants in their conduct. Both ensure ethical behavior on part of the civil servants. 30-25 वर्ड के अंदर मैंने सब कुछ लिख डाला एक तरीके से. कोड ऑफ एथिक्स, कोड ऑफ एथिक्स दोनों एक्सप्लेन भी कर दिए, इंपॉर्टेंस भी एक्सप्लेन कर दिए. इंपॉर्टेंस बताना जरूरी है ना. जब भी एथिक्स में क्वेश्चन सोचें, जब भी क्वेश्चन सामने आए, थिंक ऑफ आंसरिंग अ फ्यू थिंग्स कि क्या वो उस क्वेश्चन में रेलेवेंट है. दैट इज, व्हाई इज दैट पर्टिकुलर थिंग इंपॉर्टेंट, व्हाट इज द इंप्लीकेशन ऑफ दैट थिंग, व्हाट आर द शॉर्टकमिंग्स इन दैट थिंग, व्हाट आर द गुड थिंग्स अबाउट दैट थिंग. ये जो आइडिया है उसके 3-4 ये डायमेंशन सोचें और देखिए कि उस क्वेश्चन में क्या एप्लीकेबल है. वील सी हाउ वी कैन फॉलो दैट अप्रोच हियर. सो दिस वन सेज दैट द कोड ऑफ कंडक्ट एंड कोड ऑफ एथिक्स आर सोर्स ऑफ गाइडेंस इन पब्लिक एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन. देयर इज अ कोड ऑफ कंडक्ट ऑलरेडी इन ऑपरेशन. So we know that we have all India civil service conduct rules, we have central civil service conduct rules, etc. Right? So you can mention about that. You will definitely get an extra mark from the examiner for just mentioning about AIS conduct rules 1968 and central civil services conduct rules 1964. Then it says there is code of conduct already in operation, whereas code of ethics is not yet put in place. Now see, तो आपने थोड़ा बहुत एक्सप्लेन कर दिया कोड ऑफ कंडक्ट क्या होता है, कोड ऑफ एथिक्स क्या होता है, इसका इंपॉर्टेंस क्या होता है, और ये बता दिया कि कोड ऑफ कंडक्ट ऑलरेडी प्लेस में है. देन suggest a suitable model for code of ethics to maintain integrity, probity and transparency in governance. Let me tell you, this question is actually nothing but a repeat of the question which UPSC asked a few years back, which was related to public service code. That what are the recommendations that have been provided by the second ARC on public service code. वो वही और क्या है, वो मॉडल कोड ऑफ एथिक्स ही तो है, पब्लिक सर्विस कोड जो है. तो उसी के अगर आप कुछ पर्सपेक्टिव एक्सप्लेन कर देंगे, सेकंड एआरसी का भी नाम डाल देंगे, यू विल डेफिनेटली गेट मार्क्स इन दिस पर्टिकुलर क्वेश्चन. सो लेट्स लुक एट व्हाट आर द थिंग्स दैट वी कैन राइट. इसके अंदर बहुत ज्यादा डिस्कशन का स्कोप है नहीं क्वेश्चन के अंदर, सो आई विल क्विकली टेल यू व्हाट आर द थिंग्स दैट शुड गो इनटू दिस पर्टिकुलर क्वेश्चन. वन, इन दिस क्वेश्चन you should explain code of conduct and code of ethics briefly. Very briefly, right? And you should also mention importance of two. It is a source of guidance in situations. ऐसे आप लिख सकते हैं that civil servants often face number of dilemmas while performing the duties of their office. In such situations, code of ethics and code of conduct can come in handy for them. और एक illustration दे दीजिएगा. A civil servant was offered a gift by a government contractor, and in this situation he was caught in a dilemma. Code of conduct and code of ethics can help him navigate this difficult situation. या कुछ और ऐसा दे दीजिए that a civil servant has been asked to do something which is not illegal but possibly unethical by a minister. In such a situation, code of ethics and code of conduct can help in navigate through this dilemma. Code of conduct is a set of do's and don'ts. On the other hand, code of ethics is a set of broad principles that should guide the action of a civil servant. In India, the present status, then you will write. Again, the point that I'm trying to tell you is, स्टोरी बनाना जरूरी है. अब आप स्टोरी कैसे बनाएं? पहले एक जंगल का राजा था और फिर वो जंगल का राजा जो है बड़ा पावरफुल था और उसने सबको मारा और व्हाटएवर, या फिर एक जंगल था, जंगल में बहुत सारे जानवर थे और एक जंगल का राजा था. सी, whichever way you make the story doesn't matter. Here we are telling that story only. तो आप इंपॉर्टेंस बता दें पहले और फिर कोड ऑफ एथिक्स और कोड ऑफ कंडक्ट को एक्सप्लेन कर दें. यू एक्सप्लेन ब्रीफली कोड ऑफ कंडक्ट, कोड ऑफ एथिक्स, फिर इंपॉर्टेंस बता दें, मर्जी आपकी है. पर इसको एक ऐसा तरीके से लिखिएगा which is compelling to the examiner. The moment the examiner sees that he understands how the story has been weaved. That's why I'm saying again and again, every answer that you're writing is literally a story. Anyway, so then you talk about the present status, you talk about AIS conduct rules, you talk about Central Civil Service conduct rules, etc. But you then they say that code of ethics अभी तक formulate नहीं हुआ है. अब यहां पर आप second ARC की recommendation ले आइएगा. Second ARC has recommended a public service code that can act as a model code of ethics, which would include the following items or which would include the following aspects to ensure integrity, probity, ट्रांसपेरेंसी एक्सेट्रा इन गवर्नेंस. ये सब चीजें जो है उसके अंदर इंटीग्रिटी, प्रोबिटी, ट्रांसपेरेंसी के बारे में बात की. यू कैन टॉक अबाउट दैट. सो व्हाट आर द वेरियस एस्पेक्ट्स ऑफ दिस पब्लिक सर्विस कोड? क्विकली आई विल टेल यू. वन, यू कैन टॉक अबाउट दैट इट शुड डिफाइन पब्लिक सर्विस वैल्यूज. What are the public service values that should be adhered to by the civil servant? Secondly, there should be a public service authority which should continuously upgrade these service values and also ensure the enforcement of this code of ethics. Thirdly, you can talk about that a code of ethics should contain guidelines to address conflict of interest. A code of ethics should emphasize on promoting openness within the government organizations functioning. A code of ethics should try to promote accountability of the actions of the civil servants towards the citizens. ज्यादा पॉइंट्स नहीं लिख सकते. देखिए कि 10-15 पॉइंट लिख डाले, 5-6 points, and that should be more than enough, because every point will take 10 words to explain, and that should be more than enough for you to do your thing. You can talk about that code of ethics should emphasize on developing commitment to these values through examples set by leadership. So you can mention that as well in your this thing. You can talk about that code of ethics should emphasize on simplification of rules, simplification of the various laws, etc. Right? So all those kind of things can be mentioned as far as what should be there as a part of code of ethics. And then lastly, in your conclusion, what you should mention is, अब 2-3 तरीके हैं. देखिए, एक तो क्या है, आप इसको लिंक कर दीजिएगा कि what will be the impact of this. It will help in bringing transparency, reduce corruption, ensure ethical behavior on part of civil servants, etc. Or the other thing is how enforcement of code of ethics can be made strong. So you mention here about training, continuous training, awareness generation. You talk about integration with performance management. Performance management के साथ इसको integrate कर दिया जाए कि code of ethics कोई follow कर रहा है नहीं कर रहा है. You can talk about that there should be continuous evaluation that should be conducted of whether code of ethics is being followed or not. You can talk about training and education. You may also talk about creating awareness among the citizens to keep a vigil on whether the civil servants are following that code of ethics or not. Right? Whichever way you may want to conclude it, it is completely up to you in this particular question. Very simple, straightforward question. Had you looked at that previous year question which was asked by UPSC related to public service code, it would not have been a problem. एक जो केस स्टडी पूछी थी यूपीएससी ने 2019 में 19, it was very similar to this. In recent times, there has been increasing concern in India to develop effective civil service ethics, code of conduct, transparency measures, ethics and integrity systems, and anti-corruption agencies. In view of this, there is need being felt to focus on the specific areas which are directly relevant to the problems of internalizing integrity and ethics in civil services. These are as follows: anticipating specific threats to ethical standards, strengthening the ethical competence, etc., and all of that, suggest institutional measures to address the above issues. But I would say that the question which was asked, which I didn't include here, related to the ethics, the public service code by UPSC was something which was more relevant, which you could have used here while writing the answer to this question. Anyway, now let's move on.
Completing the syllabus without proper knowledge of current affairs will not take you far in the UPSC Civil Services examination. Regulate and transform your preparation with complete coverage of news of relevance. Get a concrete hold of current affairs for UPSC CSE with Vision IS Monthly Current Affairs Revision Program starting from 20th September at 5 p.m. The program is your guide to get comprehensive news on one platform sourced through relevant resources such as The Hindu, Indian Express, Economic Times, PIB, Yojana and others. Enroll for complete coverage of current affairs including Indian polity and constitution, economy, international relations, and more. Comprehensive assessment of preparation through MCQs and mains-oriented questions. Expert support through personalized mentoring and online doubt resolution.
This question, very interesting question. We were expecting a question on BNS for sure this year, or the reformed criminal laws, but my expectation was that question will be in paper 2, where I kept telling my students that please do prepare aspects related to gender equality, reforms that have been brought in the law in context of community service, how we are moving from retributive justice to reformative justice, how we are moving from providing justice to people in a speedier manner, how we are moving towards, in the newly enacted laws, to move towards the resolution of the disputes through alternate dispute resolution mechanisms, etc. तो ये सब चीजें हम बार बार ये डिस्कस कर रहे थे एग्जाम से पहले. नॉट जस्ट मी, बट आई एम श्योर दैट हैड यू बीन रीडिंग न्यूज़पेपर्स, आप बीएनएस या बीएनएसएस या जो भारतीय साक्ष्य अधिनियम है उसके स्पेसिफिक प्रोविजंस नहीं रट सकते. देखिए, लॉ का पेपर नहीं है, बट यूपीएससी एक्सपेक्ट्स यू to at least know what are the basic changes that have been made in these laws that are going to have far reaching implications on the justice delivery in India. इतना जरूर आपको पता होना चाहिए था. That is what UPSC was expecting, और वही हुआ. But very interestingly, instead of asking question in paper 2, they ended up asking question in paper 4. This year, by the way, they have done a lot of that. They have asked questions in paper 1, पॉसिबली इन सोसाइटी सेक्शन, या वो कौन से सेक्शन में आता है ये भी बताना मुश्किल है, पर वो गवर्नेंस पे क्वेश्चन पूछ लिया, एनजीओज वगैरह के ऊपर पेपर 1 में. पेपर 2 के अंदर जो है टेररिज्म से रिलेटेड क्वेश्चन पूछ लिया, दैट वन वुड हैव प्रिपेयर्ड अंडर पेपर 3 ऑफ इंटरनल सिक्योरिटी. राइट, सो दे हैव डन अ लॉट ऑफ दिस ईयर, एंड आई थिंक दे हैव डन दिस अर्लियर एज वेल, बट इस बार कुछ ज्यादा ही किया है. राइट, एंड इस बार बीएनएस के ऊपर क्वेश्चन पूछ लिया व्हेन दे आस्क्ड इट इन दिस. एआई के ऊपर क्वेश्चन, anyway we were expecting AI and ethical issues, but possibly AI and governance could have been asked in governance paper 2 as well, could have been asked in paper 3 as well. They chose paper 4. So that's something which you need to be aware of, that everything is interlinkable, everything is interlinked, and that's how you need to prepare these particular topics as well for the exam. Anyway, so now the question is, the soul of the new law, Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, is justice, equality and impartiality based on Indian culture and ethos. यहीं आपको एक इंट्रोडक्शन मिल गया, that Indian culture and ethos emphasize on values such as impartiality, etc., which were not reflected in the earlier criminal laws in the country. The newly enacted BNS ensures the above in the following manner. ऐसे इंट्रोडक्शन लिख दिया, बहुत सिंपल है, या कोई और तरीके से भी लिख सकते हैं that in Mahabharat, impartiality has been considered as one of the most important virtues to be shown by a king. This is now truly reflected in the newly enacted BNS in comparison to the colonial Indian Penal Code. Sufficient है. In the following manner, उसको फिर लिख डाला क्या क्या चीजें हैं. ठीक है. Anyway, so it says discuss this in the light of the major shift from a doctrine of punishment to justice in the present judicial system. So once you write, अब देखिए इसमें ना हिंट ऑलरेडी क्वेश्चन में दिया हुआ है. One thing is you need to relate the Indian ethos. अब वो कैसे आप करेंगे? Completely your choice. You need to relate it with the newly enacted BNS and in comparison to Indian Penal Code. This is something that you have to definitely mention in your answer somewhere or the other. Once this particular thing is mentioned, the other aspect of the question is, what are some of the major provisions of the law that reflect justice, equity, impartiality? ठीक है. एक एक पॉइंट भी लिखेंगे तो चलेगा, 2 पॉइंट लिखे, 3 पॉइंट लिखे तो और भी बहुत अच्छी बात है. सो for example, when we talk about justice and how we see that there is a transformation happening from punishment to the idea of justice, you can talk about community service. There is a provision for community service as a punishment rather than making a person go through imprisonment as such. This is nothing but a reformative approach to nyaya or justice. You can also talk about that with respect to the trials. There in the provisions of the BNS, we have included the aspects of time-bound trials. An example of how we are again trying to ensure justice to the people. You can also talk about how we have removed offenses such as, what offenses you can mention that have been removed from the BNS? Can we mention about sedition? So removal of sedition law, which was a relic of the colonial era, तो ये mention कर दिया. Equity की बात करेंगे तो you can talk about that. सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट देखिए एस्पेक्ट जो चेंज हुआ है इक्विटी के कंसर्न में, वो ये है कि जो विमेन रिलेटेड क्राइम्स है उसके चैप्टर को इट हैज बीन केप्ट बिफोर द चैप्टर रिलेटेड टू क्राइम्स अगेंस्ट द नेशन और क्राइम्स अगेंस्ट द स्टेट. सो इंपॉर्टेंस टू विमेन रिलेटेड क्राइम्स. अगेन कोशिश कीजिएगा कि इसको इंडियन एथोस से रिलेट कीजिए. दैट इन इंडिया women are worshipped and therefore the crimes related to women need to be resolved, and that shows commitment of the state to put these crimes before the crimes against the nation or crimes against the state. So you can mention that. You can also talk about enhanced punishments for crimes against women. Children. Is also something that reflects the equity aspect of the law. There are offenses such as voyeurism that have been added. if there is any act which is promoting the indecency towards women, that has also been added. You can also talk about that the definition of gender has been expanded in the law, right? We have tried to make the law gender neutral. Equity के perspective से हम बात कर सकते हैं. You can talk about impartiality. Impartiality, you can talk about there is a provision for protection of witnesses in the newly enacted laws, so that the judgments can be impartial in nature. You can mention that as well. ठीक है, इसमें और भी बहुत सारी चीजें हैं. There's a lot which is to be mentioned, but just 2 points each, 1 point each should be more than enough. Once you have mentioned all of this, then it's time for conclusion in this particular answer, which is that the BNS, therefore, on the basis of the above, shows a complete shift from the colonial mindset of coercive policing to democratic or participatory policing. It shows a mindset from retributive to the reformative justice. ऐसा कुछ करके आप इस आंसर को conclude कर सकते हैं. ठीक है. Now, let's move on. There is, by the way, no precedent to this particular kind of question which has been asked earlier. This is indeed something which is a greenfield area. Now, let's move on to the last two questions. In the Indian culture and value system, an equal opportunity has been provided irrespective of gender identity. The number of women in public service has been steadily increasing over the years. So you can talk about how the number of women in the civil services, in the armed forces, कुछ specific example दे दीजिएगा. Permanent commission allow कर रहे हैं हम women को armed forces में. Women are now allowed to get into the fighter pilot roles. You can talk about how there is an increased emphasis and push on increasing the representation of women in legislature through reservations in parliament, reservations in the panchayats, municipalities. You may also talk about how there is an increased impetus on increasing the representation of women in the judiciary as well. तो ऐसा कुछ चीजें आप बता सकते हैं. Then it says, examine gender specific challenges faced by female public servants. Gender specific challenges, what are they facing? Suggest suitable measures to increase their efficiency in discharging their duties and maintaining high standards of probity. So let's understand what are the few things that should definitely be a part of our answers in this question. Firstly, you need to talk about increasing role of women in public services. You may even give some names or examples of women in public services, those who have contributed significantly. एक दो नाम भी दे सकते हैं यहाँ पर, right? Once that is there, second part of the question is about what are the gender specific challenges that are faced by women in public services. We will discuss about it. ये सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट पार्ट ऑफ द क्वेश्चन है. एंड देन लास्ट पार्ट ऑफ द क्वेश्चन इज सजेस्ट सुटेबल मेजर्स टू इंक्रीज देयर एफिशिएंसी इन डिस्चार्जिंग देयर ड्यूटीज. सो द थर्ड पार्ट ऑफ द क्वेश्चन इज सुटेबल मेजर्स. देखिए, इस क्वेश्चन में कंक्लूजन वगैरह लिखने का स्कोप नहीं है. आई होप यू अंडरस्टैंड व्हाई. यू अंडरस्टैंड व्हाई? बिकॉज ये सब लिखते लिखते ही काम खत्म हो जाएगा. इंट्रोडक्शन का भी स्कोप नहीं है. इंट्रोडक्शन यहीं से स्टार्ट होगा. Because there are already 3 parts of the question. Even if you have to do a little bit of justice to each of these 3 parts, you will literally have no space left to write unnecessary. तो फालतू का अलग से इंट्रोडक्शन और कंक्लूजन मत लिख दिया. जब मेजर्स लिख दिए तो वही वे हेड हो गया, वही कंक्लूजन हो गया. There is no need for you to unnecessarily write a separate conclusion as well in this particular answer. This kind of understanding you need to develop for every question. Lot of times students come and ask me, sir समझ में नहीं आ रहा है, इंट्रोडक्शन कैसे लिखना है, कंक्लूजन कैसे लिखना है. ये तो आप तब जानेंगे when you attempt more and more questions. You will be able to understand what the requirement of the specific questions is only with practice, and then you will be able to understand in the exam as well that okay, this is what I should do in this particular question. I don't need to necessarily write a separate conclusion. Anyway, first part of the question I hope is already understood to all of you. Now let's quickly talk about what are the gender specific challenges that are faced by women at the workplace in the public services, right? So in this, what you can talk about is that women often are victims of stereotyping in the public services. There is a stereotyping that is done of the women, that they can do certain kind of jobs and they cannot do certain kind of jobs, that results in often women not being given field positions or field offices, etc. Or one example will be that very few secretaries to the government of India are actually women. So that is something that you can talk about. You may also talk about workplace harassment that they often face. Workplace harassment that is faced by women in India in public services. Often this workplace harassment may be outright in nature, or maybe something which is very subtle in nature as well, right? For example, making a comment on what a woman is wearing to office could be a subtle way of sexual harassment or workplace harassment that is taking place, right? Or possibly making a comment on the weight of a woman, making a comment on her body, right? Body type, something like that only is nothing but a gender specific type of harassment that takes place, or gender specific challenges that they face at workplace. Again, these are all very subtle ways, okay? Because you expect a woman to be only a certain way. You want a woman to only be dressed in a particular way to the office. You want a woman to be pretty, beautiful in your societal terms, right? You perceive, therefore, if there is a woman who has different physical features in a different manner, that in itself is nothing but a way in which women are discriminated at the workplace. So you can talk about that. You can also talk about they face a major challenge in maintaining work-life balance. Women, more often than not, have to balance not just their professional duties but their homely duties as well, which they are expected to perform, unfortunately, in which men do not tend to contribute a lot, and that also is one major challenge that is faced by the women. You can also talk about that there is a societal norms also end up creating a challenge. That is, how can, for example, how can a woman be a boss to a man, right? So you can talk about that they face various challenges due to societal norms as well. Women are always expected to be empathetic, compassionate. They can never be strict. Something like stereotyping, again, that you do not expect women to be strict in nature. You always expect at workplace that women will be always considerate. Why should it be the case? Why should it not be the same of the men, for example? Right? Again, see, no one is saying that people should not be compassionate at workplaces. But why is it that only women are expected to be compassionate? Why is it that only men are expected to be strict, and why women are not expected to be strict at workplace? Something like that. So those are some of the things that you can talk about as far as the gender specific challenges that women face. What are the suitable measures that can be taken in order to address this? One, you can mention about leadership training to be provided to women, so that they can be made capable leaders going ahead in future. एक यूपीएससी ने सवाल भी पूछा था, आई थिंक शायद 2 साल पहले या लास्ट ईयर ही पूछा था, that what is the role that is played by the civil society organizations in promoting the role of women in the society. वहीं के अंदर अगर आपने वो क्वेश्चन देखा होता, उसके कुछ एग्जांपल्स आप यहाँ पे लिख सकते थे, जागोरी कैंपेन एक्सेट्रा एंड ऑल ऑफ दैट. बहुत सारे देयर आर ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस दैट आर स्पेसिफिकली वर्किंग ऑन जेंडर एम्पावरमेंट एंड दैट टू प्रमोटिंग द रोल ऑफ women in public services and in politics and in leadership roles. So you could have mentioned something like that as well. You could also talk about sensitization. Sensitization किसका करने की जरूरत है? औरतों का कि मर्दों का? Men need to be sensitized to the kind of problems and challenges which are faced by the women. They should be appreciative of the fact that a woman is not only working at workplace but is also playing a very important role back home as well. And that's why men need to be more considerate towards the role of women at workplaces. So that is something that you can talk about. You may also talk about that there is a need to possibly create a code of ethics that should be gender neutral in nature. You can also talk about creating crèche facilities so that women don't need to bother, don't need to be concerned about what is happening to their children back home while they are at office, right? So they can balance their responsibilities of work, they can balance their responsibilities of the home as well in an ideal manner. You can also talk about there should be work from home facility also that should be created for women. You can talk about extension of maternity benefits to women. ये एक चैलेंज में भी आप यहां पे मेंशन कर सकते हैं, मैटरनिटी वाला इशू, दैट ऑफन व्हेन women undergo pregnancy or maternity, they have to end up sacrificing their career. So this is also a challenge that is faced by them, right? You can also talk about, see, अभी इसमें ना आप कितनी सारी चीजें लिख सकते हैं. You can give the recent example of the rape case in Kolkata. That in itself is an example of how women are facing a number of challenges in the society because of their gender, right? That proper rest facilities are not provided to them. Often they have to go at odd hours to remote places. They should be provided some kind of transport facilities as well. So transport facilities, and you can mention that as a challenge as well. Another big challenge that actually women face is that there are lack of women centric facilities in offices. Right? Women specific toilets are missing in courtrooms, in courts, right? Women specific toilets are missing in offices, right? So those are the kind of challenges that they often end up facing at work, and they can be addressed through some of these measures. Those are some of the aspects. So एक अगर आप notice करेंगे, this question is more actually, I would say, falls in the area of society rather than falling into the area of ethics per se, right? But again, gender specific discrimination वगैरह की बात आ गई, तो you can talk about all of these things here. Anyway, so this is the question now. अब now let's move on, और फिर उसके अंदर एक लास्ट लाइन अगर एकदम एंड में कंक्लूजन लिखना है तो you can write down that therefore by taking above measures we can ensure increase the labor force participation of women in the public services as well. Let's look at the last question. Mission Karmayogi. It says that Mission Karmayogi is aiming for maintaining a very high standard of conduct and behavior to ensure efficiency for serving citizens and in turn developing oneself. So it is aimed at developing the capacity of the civil servants, making them more professionally competent, and yet in the same time ensuring that the services that are delivered to the citizens are delivered in an efficient manner. How will this scheme empower the civil servants in enhancing productive efficiency and delivering services at the grassroots level? So basically कुछ नहीं है, you have to talk about some of the important aspects of Mission Karmayogi. 4-5 चीजें भी पता है, that is more than enough, and just related to how it will help in improving public service delivery. And you also talk about that how it will play a very important role in ensuring the grassroots delivery of the services to the citizens, etc., and all of those things as well. So let's quickly talk about some of the pointers in this question. I'm not going through कि क्या structure होगा and all of that. Basically आप पहले कुछ जो है बता दीजिए. National Program for Civil Services Capacity Building or Mission Karmayogi aims at transforming the civil services in India by building the capacity of the civil service to deal with 21st century challenges. ऐसा कुछ लिख सकते हैं. Or you can say that civil services in India are the backbone of the governance structure, of the administrative structure. And this mission Karmayogi aims at transforming the civil services to make them more competent to address the unique challenges of 21st century. इस तरीके से you can write the introduction to this particular question. Now, what is the significance of this scheme? Let's quickly talk about that. Few things that we can talk about. In this scheme, firstly, there is an emphasis on tailored programs for every individual who's a part of the civil services. So we are trying to address the shortcomings. We are trying to take into account the background of a civil servant, what all training that they have already undergone, what all skills that they have, and specifically impart skills to them on the basis of the job, on the basis of the role that they are supposed to satisfy. So you can talk about that we are trying to impart through tailored training programs certain behavioral skills to the civil servants. We are trying to infuse into them certain domain specific skills as well, which can help them in dealing with the challenges that the civil servants face in the functioning of their office. So that is something. You can also talk about that there is a competency framework which has been created in this particular scheme, which can help the civil servants to know their progress, where they stand, what are the areas in which they need to develop their competency. All of the entire training program is designed in such a manner. Thirdly, this program also includes feedback and constant evaluation, so that civil servants know where they stand, what are the improvements and changes that they need to bring about in their learning approach, so that they can act as efficient change makers in the society. So you can mention that. You can also talk about that how Mission Karmayogi promotes learning from best practices as a part of the entire program. It focuses on collaborative functioning of government officers, for them to collaborate in their learning, for them to collaborate in their functioning as well. So that is also something which can be talked about. You can also mention that Mission Karmayogi specifically emphasizes on citizen-centric administration, on improving the quality of the delivery of the services to the citizens by consistently understanding the challenges that are faced by the citizens. So it focuses on citizen-centric administration. That thing you can mention. You may also talk about that it emphasizes on adhering to ethical conduct and values, so which will ensure that there is probity in governance. So ethical conduct resulting in probity in governance. Do remember one thing, that in ethics, especially in this ethics in administration section, if you remember the syllabus of the examination, if you remember the key words that have been mentioned in the syllabus, let's say probity, let's say ethical dilemma, है ना, तो यहाँ पे आप mention कर सकते हैं, it can help them in address. So when they will be taught ethical conduct, it will help them in navigating through various ethical dilemmas that they face in the functioning of their office. It will help them to develop a competency framework which will help them to become objective in, or to develop objectivity in the functioning of their office. This feedback and constant evaluation would help them in developing professional competence and being able to compete with the other civil servants in an efficient manner. So point being try to use as many terms as you can from the syllabus of the exam of your paper. The more terms you throw in here and there, the better it will be. एक आप डायग्राम भी बना सकते हैं. Effects of Mission Karmayogi, and then you can mention improved efficiency, improved accountability, transparency. दो चार चीजें ऐसा करके लिख दिया. See, because you have to understand that ये बहुत ही generic question है. लिख तो हर कोई देगा ना, पर इसमें ये तीन चार स्पेसिफिक चीजें मेंशन करना जरूरी है. कॉम्पिटेंसी फ्रेमवर्क हो गया, टेलर्ड प्रोग्राम्स हो गया, कोलैबोरेटिव फंक्शनिंग, बेस्ट प्रैक्टिसेस एक्सेट्रा, एंड देन जस्ट रिलेटेड टू द एथिकल values and the terms that we have been provided in the syllabus. So then you can finally say that Mission Karmayogi is an innovative step taken by the government of India in order to democratize the functioning of the civil services in India, in order to provide the best skills to the civil servants in the country so that they can continue to act as the steel frame of the Indian administration or something like that. ऐसे कुछ करके आप इसको conclude कर सकते हैं, right? So this is what we have to keep in mind with this question. Yes, please tell me. Sorry? Rule? Yes, you can mention that from rule-based to role-based transformation also can be carried out of the civil services, where they will be not just oriented towards following the rules and regulations, but also specifically performing the role that they are supposed to perform by, again, being imparted specific skills, specific domain oriented skills which are required for performing their jobs, right? So you can mention that. Yes, any other question? Yes. You can make a very brief reference to the Vishakha guidelines when you are talking about measures. Yes, of course, you can mention that in the last question. Yes, any other questions? Okay, so this is all about the discussion for the ethics in governance portion, right? Even though, as I said, that there are a few questions which can easily be cross-referenced to the ethics in governance portion apart from these questions as well, and that is a very interesting format which UPSC has adopted this year. This year they have not really asked question on attitude, emotional intelligence, persuasion, ये सब के ऊपर ज़्यादा question नहीं कुछ पूछा है ना. Most of the questions, even जो quote based questions आप देखेंगे, quotation based questions हैं, third question, उसमें भी you will find that it is actually largely related to ethics in governance. But that's not how the trend is always going to remain. So you should not expect कि ऐसा ही होगा future years में. It may change slightly in the future years as well. Anyway, so this is all that was there from my side. If you have any queries or any doubts, please feel free to mail and I'll be happy to respond to your queries. Right? Thank you so much.